thank you for that introduction. My name is Adib, rhymes with Adweeb if you ever forget how to pronounce it. The title of this talk is Going with the Flow, the neglected role of reflection in digital education games. And so, what I want to do to get started here is I'm going to jump back to 2003, more precisely the summer of 2003. When I was trying to think of an image to characterize what this time period was like, I decided to choose the iPod. I think this is a perfect example of what it was like during this time. Nobody had smartphones all the time, walking around staring at them. People made more eye contact and things like that. What happened was my family decided to go gambling at Atlantic City, and me being 12 or 13 years old at the time wasn't able to go because it's illegal. And so what my brother did is that he bought me a game called Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, knowing I was a huge Star Wars fan. And so as soon as they left at 8 a.m. in the morning, I decided to play this game. Popped in the disc, and immediately I thought this world was very familiar, yet it was very new at the same time. I remember being very struck by how cinematic it was. I was thinking, is this a movie or is it a game? Is it both? What is this thing? And so another really interesting quality of this sort of game that I never encountered before was like the high degree of agency and control that I had over identity building, character development, character customization, and things like that. And so, as I continued to play, I also encountered really interesting, complex ethical decision making um, aspects of the game that really encouraged reflection. The game would ask me, do you want to be a bad guy or do you want to be a good guy? And what are you going to do about it in the game world? And how are you going to deal with the repercussions of your decisions? There was also games within games, this weird thing that I never encountered before either. And interestingly, to draw a parallel, while my family was gambling in Atlantic City, I was playing a gambling game within the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic universe. And so I started playing at 8 a.m., and I didn't stop until my family returned. And so the problem was that they returned at around 2 a.m. And so what happened was in those 16 glorious hours of playing, I barely ate. I didn't remember feeling hungry. I remember feeling like I almost time traveled. I didn't notice time passing. And my mom was not happy. When she came home, saw me sitting in the same exact spot, maybe with like a can of soda and a bag of chips next to me, she was really, really angry with me. And we'd had this argument before about how much time I devote to video games. But interestingly, this time was different. There was something different about this case. It felt unjust, and I almost felt cheated in a way. And it was mostly because I could not articulate this really powerful experience that I just had. I didn't know how I could possibly have lost 16 hours, not felt the urge to eat. And the best way I was able to articulate it as a young person was I was just playing a game. That's what I was doing. It was just another video game. And what made it even more strange is that I thought, weren't my family also engaged in play? Isn't that why they went to the casino? Weren't they just playing a game for adults? And so I later discovered there was a term for this sort of experience, and obviously it's called flow, published and made popular rather by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. That's how you pronounce his name. And one of the things I want to start off with is that flow experience aren't really new. So Herodotus, back in the fifth century BC, he tells us that there was a great scarcity throughout the whole land of Lydia, and they were trying to, and scarcity here means a famine, and they're trying to devise a remedy or solution to this problem. And the solution that he says they came up with was that the people of Lydia would play knucklebones, which is actually a precursor to the dice that we have today, and then not eat the other day, and sort of alternate in this way so that they could survive through a big famine. And Herodotus also tells us that in this way they passed 18 years, right? So I thought 16 hours was bad. 18 years is way, way, way longer. And so some of the main characteristics of the way that Csikszentmihalyi characterizes flow from his this is adapted from his TED talk in 2004. He uses words like focused, concentrated, ecstasy, inner clarity. The activity is doable. There's serenity. There's timelessness, and also intrinsic motivation, right? So that whatever produces flow becomes its own reward. And another way to look at it that you'll find often in the internet with more colorful diagrams today is that flow is the delicate balance between skill and challenge, avoiding the extremes of both high tension and anxiety, and high boredom, the tedium of boredom, right? And so when he describes these activities like music playing, rock climbing, dancing, or playing chess, he says what makes these activities conducive to flow is that they were designed to make optimal experience easier to achieve. He goes on to say these types of activities have rules that require the learning of skills. They set up goals. They provide feedback. They also make control possible. So these aspects, rules, goals, feedback, control, or agency, these are all the ingredients of not only games and learning experiences, but they're also baked into the design of all the technologies that we use today. So the people that I call that are engaged in doing this is called they call them flow benders, right? This is based on Avatar: The Last Airbender, a great show that you should watch if you have not already seen it. And so these flow engineers, what they do is they shape engaging experiences for many reasons, but primarily it's driven by profit maximization, right? It's extremely lucrative in the attention economy, where attention is a commodity now, to keep you on a device as long as humanly possible. And the secrets of flow bending are almost in like countless books, and they use different terms. Like there's some people that call it persuasive technologies, others call it being hooked, and even nudge, which is about choice architecture, or like building a set of choices that will lead or shape someone to a given or desired decision. And one way of conceptualizing this strange thing about these different terms, I want to talk about Neil Postman, who in 1992 or 1993 said that new technologies sometimes commandeer our terms. So radical technologies create new definitions of old terms without our being fully conscious of it. Technology does not pause to tell us, and we do not pause to ask about these changes that happen. New things also modify old words, right? Things that have deep rooted meanings, so like flow, for example. The old words still look the same, but they do not have the same meanings in some cases. And in some extreme cases, I would say they have the opposite meaning. And the word here obviously is flow. So we have on the left Csikszentmihalyi's conceptualization of flow: fulfilling, flourishing, creativity inducing, ecstasy inducing. And then on the right hand side, I'm going to talk about in a second, we have another negative side of flow, the darker side, about extracting, extinguishing, depleting, and mindless inducing activities. And this is based on a book published in 2012 by Natasha Dow called Addiction by Design: Machine Gambling in Las Vegas. And it's basically a rigorous examination of the interplay between, among rather, users, designers, and objects surrounding specifically video gaming addiction, and slot machines and machine gambling, things like that. And this is a crude oversimplification of an amazing book, but her central thesis is basically that some objects, by virtue of their unique structural characteristics, meaning their unique design, these are more likely than others to trigger or accelerate an addiction or lead to certain kinds of behaviors, right? And some of the examples that she gives on her talks that you can watch on YouTube, she talks about ergonomic seat design, where some of the designs of the seat, they talk about actually designing it so that it will reduce the possibility of cutting off the circulation in your legs so that you stay seated as long as possible to increase what's called time on device, right? Um, Furthermore, they actually design the slot machines away from the pulling of a lever to buttons that are just creating the least amount of movement of your hand. So they're actually like physically and literally reducing the opportunities for pausing and reflecting. And the interesting thing about this panel that she talks about is the title of it was called Building a Better Mousetrap: The Science of Ergonomics. And so if you've seen this meme, I don't know if there's some sort of decision making by someone also about trying to increase time on device with gaming chairs that tend to resemble toddler seats. But she goes on to say, and this is around 2013, 2014, that much of the same design of slot machines is now in social media, which you've probably all heard now. It's been like 10 years since people have been talking about this. And in particular, it's this slot machine mechanic, where when we refresh the feed in this infinite timeline scrolling type of thing, it's really creating those same conditions of the feeling of, again, playing a slot machine. And you may say, okay, fair. That's mobile app design. That. What does that have to do with games? What does that have to do with educational games, right? So what I want to turn to now is there was a talk in 2016 given called "Let's Go Whaling: Tricks for Monetizing Mobile Game Players with Free to Play." And I want to bring it back to Postman, who was right, because this new technology, a mobile phone, created a whole new ecosystem of mobile games and mobile game design that I think really did truly change everything. And the best way to sum up and characterize this design philosophy is that it's both a culture and a set of design practices that try to optimize for flow, but not in Csikszentmihalyi's conceptualization, not the positive kind, but the more negative kind of machine gambling. And you'll find this language in his talk. So whales are typically big spenders in casino speak, right? And so he's borrowing, he's lending gambling talk in the title of his talk. And he actually starts out by saying he wants to leave the morality out of it. Then he goes on to cite a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he says, okay, we need to make things immediately useful. We need to design for immediate gratification. The fast thinking is what you want. You don't want the analytical mind to be triggered at all. He then goes on to say, make sure that your games aren't too skill based. A too skill based game don't get people to pay. He'll then leverage the Bartle types, which is a great tool that's quite old, actually from probably like 70s, mid 70s, that's used for analysis and the design of games. But he then turns it into a monetization strategy. So you sell convenience to achievers, you sell customization to socializers, you sell competitive advantage to the killers, you sell content to the explorers. And so I've argued elsewhere, and I can't get into it now, but Fortnite is also like a creative giant slot machine that I think was heavily influenced by the design of mobile games, right? And it also had this free to play model as well. And the success of this game was so massive, and I think it continues to create expectations and encourage design practices of not only regular games but educational games, right? Because there's a lot of language again around engaging games and engaging learning experiences that tie these things together. So before I turn to solutions right now, I just want to summarize what I've just talked about so far. So there's a tension between two types of flow. There's negative and positive, and their design are both mediated and negotiated by these new technologies, right? And so we have to parse through what are people really saying when they're using words like flow, engagement, and things like that. But there's also a tension between flow and reflection. In particular, for educational games or games for learning, you need reflection. Reflection is the moment where things get passed to long-term memory, and then you're able to use it for problem solving in other domains. And things that are optimized for flow may not create time or opportunities for reflection. And so the point is to have a delicate balance between these two things. And so a step towards a solution. There's a lot, but two main strategies given the time constraints I want to talk about are two things. This is encouraging the development of gaming and playing as a literacy, and then the second one is making thinking visible. So by gaming literacy, I'm borrowing heavily from James Paul G, which is another great book. If you have not read, you should read this book. It'll change your life and probably provide the best models for how to think about using gaming for learning. And the way that he conceptualizes literacy and how I do as well, thanks to him, it's not about reading words, but it's about the ability to articulate, recognize, and critically produce meaning and problem solve in a given learning domain, right? So one good way of doing this, and I am a mentor and a judge for Games for Change. I've been doing it for a few years. Fantastic initiative by Games for Change. And so one way to do this is to help not even kids or even adults design their own games. Because when you design your own games, you start to use and be able to articulate a conceptual design toolkit about what leads to good game design and what leads to bad game design. And then you can also figure out when someone is trying to create tricky addictive types of mechanics. So this is what I mean by literacy, and this is a great initiative that you can do with Games for Change, but also if you're a parent, for example, play games with your kids. Talk to them about the design of the games. Develop a language around doing that. And the second thing I want to talk about is making thinking visible. And the way I want to quickly conceptualize this is to bring up a really great book about web usability called Don't Make Me Think. And he talks about good web design is actually about trying to get rid of the question marks. You don't want your user to think. And again, this is good for the web. This is good for apps. You want to let your user do something. But what I want to say, this is the opposite thing that we want to do for designing educational games. We want to make thinking visible. We want to take full advantage of the affordances of video game technologies to do this. So, a great example I'm going to talk about to show how you can make thinking visible without even resorting to digital technologies to actually find inspiration from analog is to talk about Monopoly and its strange history, which I'm going to gloss over. You can find a lot of information online, but this is probably the best book on the subject. So, Monopoly was not, in fact, invented by Charles Darrow in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression. This great story where he sold it, becomes very wealthy overnight. This is not what actually would happen. The game was actually invented as a earlier iteration called the Landlord's Game by a woman named Lizzie McGee back in 1904 and 1905. And on the right here, you'll see her patent from 1904, in fact. And this was the Landlord's Game. And in fact, it was designed to teach. So this was like an educational game. It was educational, right? It had educational intent versus other games that existed at the time. And so I want to argue that the Landlord's Game in its earliest iteration was basically an analog simulation to help people, and you'll find the language in the advertisements for the game, learn the cause of the panic. We're talking about financial panic, sort of like what we're kind of in right now, by playing the Landlord's Game. Also hidden in this like little advertisement is a practical demonstration in miniature of our present land system. And so this analog simulation is trying to make invisible and confusing, trying to make visible an invisible and confusing financial system and what was going on at the time. And some of the characteristic things that we know about Monopoly, like people getting into fights, that's actually what she was going for, because she actually created two rule sets. She had the monopolist rule set, which actually turned into Monopoly through a history that I don't have time to cover now, but it's in the book. But she also made an anti-monopoly rule set or a prosperity rule set. And so her game design, again, this is like 100 years ago, is so great for education and for learning, because she literally designed and created the conditions for deep reflection by creating two diametrically opposed rule sets for the same exact like physical game that you would play. And if you look at her language about her talking about it in 1902, probably her first known commentary about the game, her game design philosophy was driven by a fierce defense of learner and player agency. Agency is about control, it's about freedom. It's the exact opposite of what the flow benders, the flow engineers are trying to do. She did not care so much if people like would follow the prosperity rule set. All she cared, and you can see this in her language, she's like, let the children once see the gross injustice of the present land system by playing this game. And when they grow up, if they are allowed to develop naturally, again, this like idea of freedom again, and not being involved in directing someone, letting people come to their own decisions, the evil will soon be remedied, right? And so I think we should all try to be like Lizzie McGee in a lot of ways. And I want to close with three last closing comments here. One is that I think if we're going to really use the full affordances and advantages of digital games for learning and education, we need to recognize that this sort of negative flow design really permeates our entire culture. This binge culture of Netflix and all this kind of stuff, it's everywhere. And that's fine for certain moments, but what I'm arguing here is that perhaps it doesn't belong in educational games. Maybe we need to pause and reflect and do something a little bit differently. The second thing I want to say is to ask good questions about these new techniques. I literally saw this yesterday on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, you should add a skeptical button. I'm not curious about this. I'm skeptical about it, because now people want to use blockchain to learn to earn and earn to learn. I'm not sure what's going to come of this, but I think we should ask good questions about new techniques and how these new technologies, again, like Postman said, tend to redefine what it means to learn, right? Just learn to earn. I'm a little skeptical of this. And lastly, I want to say that we should always try to find moments to pause to look at our reflection, whether that's figurative or metaphorical, and like don't always go with the flow. I think there's moments where we should pause and see what's going on with educational games and these new technologies. That's all I had. Thank you very much.